Agenda is approved then if there are no other points. Thank you.
Dann kommen wir.
So we now come to today's order of business. First of all, the debate on, or the statements on the EU-Turkey summit. First of all, President in Office, Mr. Schmit.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Mr. President. In French, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for inviting along the presidency of the Council to participate in this debate on cooperation with Turkey, and more specifically on the results of the summit which was held on Sunday. The presidency welcomes the results of this summit, which was organized at the initiative of the President of the European Council, and which you yourself attended. You were there throughout it, Mr. President. I think we must also thank and congratulate the first Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Timmermans, who negotiated the action plan with the Turkish authorities. I'd like to thank him most warmly for his commitment and hard work. This summit was most timely, for it allowed us to tackle crucial questions for the security of the European Union. Our relations with Turkey, particularly against the current backdrop, are of especial importance. They're important in terms of questions relating to migration and also more broadly. Together with Turkey, we have a lot of shared interests, and our cooperation is essential for us to face up to the three major crises that are facing us and facing Turkey as well. First of all, there is the ongoing war in Syria and the pressing need to find a political solution to that conflict, which is proving especially deadly and is generating considerable destabilization. Then there is the problem of refugees, which is directly related to conflict, and then finally the terrorism which struck in Paris but which also has struck in Turkey and elsewhere. This must be tackled implacably. This summit allowed us to reach clear and tangible results and allowed us to reaffirm the need for increased cooperation and regular dialogue. We need to breathe new life into our relations. We need to liberalize the visa regime. We need to look at readmission rules and financial and humanitarian aid for the benefit of the thousands of refugees in Turkey. These are clear and palpable results from the summit. I think we also need to point out that everything agreed with Turkey must, I think, encourage us to continue our work within the European Union. All measures relative to better surveillance of our borders and better border checks at our external borders, relocation policies, and an assortment of other initiatives relating to borders must be pursued. Everything that was decided should be implemented, and everything that still requires a decision should be decided on swiftly. You will understand, Mr. President, that it is not the Council's intention to provide a detailed stock-taking of the summit. I feel confident that the first Vice President of the Commission will share his assessment of this meeting. However, as is noted in the final declaration of the summit, all the points agreed on Sunday should be implemented together and should also be carefully assessed. And I think the same holds true of the accession process. All the conditions, all of them applicable to candidate countries, and all candidate countries are obviously applicable to Turkey as well. and the Council will pay a special attention to what was agreed on last Sunday. We will ensure that this is properly implemented and implemented in a way that reflects solidarity. Parliament will, of course, be kept apprised of the follow-up to these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmit. Now, on behalf of the Commission, Vice President Timmermans.
President. President Jean-Claude Juncker has asked me to debrief you on his behalf, since I was also at the summit. By the way, President Schulz, you were at the summit yourself. You intervened and you were there for the whole duration of the summit, so Parliament was very well represented and an integral part of our decision-making. I hope President Schulz will share Jean-Claude Juncker's view and my view that this summit was fruitful and opened a new chapter in the EU's partnership with Turkey. Since April, the EU has held 4 meetings at heads of state and government level to discuss the migration crisis. At each of these meetings we said it was necessary to engage with Turkey. This is what we did on Sunday. It is clear that we need to cooperate to secure our borders and to jointly bring order into migratory flows and stem irregular migration. But the focus of the summit went far beyond the current refugee crisis. Turkey is a strategic partner for Europe in many areas: trade, the economy, foreign policy, energy, customs. At the summit, we reached agreement on how to move forward in all key areas of our cooperation. We agreed on the need for structured and frequent and more dynamic high-level dialogue. We decided to have summits twice a year to discuss mutual relations and international issues. We hope that meeting created a new partnership, both on refugee-related matters and beyond. Just to name one example, the recent and atrocious attacks in Paris and Ankara, including a bomb again last night, have also shown how Europe and Turkey are both confronted with the same security threats and reinforced our resolve to step up counter-terrorism cooperation, which should be a strong focus of this dialogue. This new chapter of our relationship, of our partnership, will not lead to a situation where we would forget about the remaining divergences and differences we can have with Turkey. Human rights, freedom of the press, all this will be matters we will come back again and again to. We need to work with Turkey in order to narrow our positions. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The Commission is now working to ensure implementation is carried out swiftly, effectively and immediately. The Commission will prepare a report on the state of play for the 15th of December European Council. To go more specifically into what was agreed. First, re-energizing the EU-Turkey relationship must also mean putting new energy in the ongoing accession negotiations. The summit declaration jointly welcomes the decision to hold the Intergovernmental Conference on the 14th of December for the opening of Chapter 17 on Economic and Monetary Union. In a letter sent by President Juncker to Prime Minister Davutoglu, the Commission reiterated its commitment to complete the preparatory work for the opening in the first quarter of 2016 of Chapters 15 on energy, 23 on judiciary and fundamental rights, 24 on justice, freedom and security, 26 on education and culture, and 31 on foreign, security and defence policy. Second, Turkey has committed to accelerate the fulfilment of the visa liberalisation benchmarks, and we welcome that. The Commission will assist Turkey in this endeavour and strive to achieve visa liberalisation for Turkish citizens in the Schengen zone by October 2016, provided, of course, all requirements have been met by then. We want to accelerate, but we don't want to change the requirements. They will remain firm and need to be applied fully. By the way, Turkey didn't ask for us to relax the requirements. Progress needs to be made on the management of borders, asylum and migration, quality of travel documents, and the respect of minorities' rights. Moreover, the visa liberalisation process can only go hand in hand with substantial progress on the EU-Turkey readmission agreement, notably on the obligation to take back third country nationals. The date for full implementation of the readmission agreement has been considerably brought forward and is now set for June 2016, compared to initially October 2017. Thirdly, we agreed on addressing together the refugee crisis. We agreed to activate the joint action plan that was agreed at referenda on the 15th of October and welcomed by heads of state and government of the EU's 28 member states at the European Council held the same day. This is a joint action plan to step up cooperation on migration management in a coordinated effort to tackle the refugee crisis. It identifies a series of actions for both the European Union and the Republic of Turkey. The aim is twofold. This is about confronting common challenges in a concerted manner and supplementing Turkey's efforts in managing the large number of people in need of international protection in Turkey. On Sunday, Turkey committed to implementing immediately the elements agreed on in the action plan, notably immediate action to stem the flow of irregular migrants to the EU and to improve the socio-economic situation of Syrians under temporary protection in Turkey. Both sides reaffirmed their shared commitment to step up the fight against smugglers. The EU has committed to provide immediate and continuous humanitarian assistance in Turkey, including through its overall financial support. The Commission has put forward its decision. The Turkey refugee facility was adopted last week. On Sunday, there was consensus among leaders that the EU is committed to provide an initial €3 billion of additional resources. The need for and nature of this funding will be reviewed in the light of the developing situation. The details will be worked out with the EU member states by the next European Council. But let me be crystal clear about the destination for these funds. This is not money for Turkey, but money to provide help to refugees in Turkey. This is money to provide for medical care, for Syrians, for schooling, and for better living conditions for Syrian refugees in Turkey. I hope this House will not question the importance of burden sharing, not only within the EU, but also with all our neighbours. We have put in place several instruments for that: the Syrian Trust Fund, the African Trust Fund, and the Turkey Refugee Facility. Let me finish on the question of resettlement. I have repeatedly stressed also before you that you take a lot of human misery out of the equation if you have resettlement. You take the criminal networks out of the equation, all the risks people take to come to Europe, and you introduce a fair burden sharing by the international community. And by the way, you can identify precisely who you invite to come to Europe. Resettlement is part of the overall partnership with Turkey set out on Sunday. It is explicitly referred to under point 6 of the summit declaration. The next steps on resettlement were discussed in the margins of the summit. The Commission will prepare a framework for such a voluntary scheme by the 15th of December. I want to repeat what President Juncker has said. This will be an open and voluntary process. Those member states willing to join this common undertaking will tell us if yes or no they would like to be part of this endeavour, which the Commission deems very necessary. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. Now, on behalf of the EPP, Chairman Weber.
Herr Vizepräsident der Rats.
President in office, Vice President of the Commission. It's good that this EU-Turkey summit took place. I'd like to thank the Commission, Frans Timmermans, for the work that's been put in to allow us to have achieved some results as well. But let's be frank. The summit took place above all because we see that via the Balkan route we have a major migration issue that needs to be addressed. Let's also be frank, because the problems are so big, because an EU member state, Greece, cannot implement Schengen standards at its external borders. So, ladies and gentlemen, all the border guards that we're using to build up internal security within the EU, if between Bavaria and Austria, between Sweden and Denmark, between France and Germany, if all of those border troops and police who are being used there and deployed there, if we use them to secure the Greek-Turkish border, I think we would be doing a much better job than what we're doing at the moment in the EU. So we need to be frank that we have our homework to do as well. We have to make sure that our borders are properly enforced. The offers held out to Turkey are considerable, and according to my group there are still some questions that remain. For example, full liberalisation of visa facilitation. That will give rise to issues. We have the problems of overstayers in various countries, people who come to countries and then don't leave when they're meant to. It'll be absolutely necessary that in Europe we think up a system of entry-exit, at least to be able to document who are overstayers, who are staying beyond their welcome. Opening new chapters for negotiation, that gives us an opportunity to start discussions. We support that. At the same time, it needs to be understood that the results of these negotiations have to remain open. We want to be frank with our partners. Finally, the 3 billion is being provided by our side. The Commission is suggesting 500 million be put on the table ASAP, and we hope that the Member States will come good as well. When we're talking about money, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like also to say that other countries in the region are also doing a great deal. We talk about Turkey, but what about Lebanon? What about Jordan? There are many countries doing enormous amounts of work, and I hope that we don't have to have a migratory wave before we start trying to push for degrees of partnership for these countries as well, before we try and support them. And finally, I'd like to make it clear that we support the Commission's approach, i.e. being pragmatic in trying to find solutions, but also bearing in mind the critical issues that we need to address with our partner Turkey. In the progress reports of the Commission, this has been done. Media freedom, fundamental freedoms, human rights, things being maintained in our dialogue with Turkey. I think that those need to be addressed very clearly. Thank you for that clarity from your side as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very good that this summit took place. Now we're going to take this step by step by way of implementation, and the unresolved issues hopefully will be resolved in a constructive fashion in the coming weeks. Mr. Weber, Mr. Epitideios would like to put a question to you. Go ahead.
Thank you for accepting my question. I see that you're very willing to point the finger at Greece, saying that it is not fulfilling its commitments. Have you thought about what responsibility lies on the shoulders of your country, not only in the creation, but also the tackling of this problem? Have you considered the fact that you're saying that you seem to be able to tackle this, but as soon as you heard the outcry from your people, you closed the borders? Have you really considered the responsibilities that you had, saying that you're providing support, but you're not telling Turkey to keep people there and create the checkpoints over there so that the hotspots are there and we don't have people coming to the rest of Europe? Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Weber. On the contrary to our colleague, I'm not speaking first and foremost as a national member of Parliament. I'm speaking on behalf of my group, and on behalf of my group I can assure you that the balance is being struck between solidarity and maintaining external borders. At least we attempt to tread that line. We have another country that has state territory on the African continent. So in Ceuta and Melilla they have to Spain has to enforce borders. It's part and parcel of what needs to be done, and it's part of the truth of the discussions that need to be led. We will not be able to guarantee Europe's security without maintaining those borders, and if Spain can do it, then I'm sure we can expect other countries to do it as well. On behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, Mr. Pittella, the Chairman.
Thank you very much, President. I think that the agreement with Turkey is an opportunity for everyone. But it isn't a blank check. We Socialists and Democrats have not altered our position. From our point of view, the future of Turkey lies in the European Union, so it's extremely positive that we should restart negotiations and that we should talk about the issue of visas. Turkey needs the EU because this is a kind of a protective barrier from sliding into lack of democracy. And we need Turkey too because it's a force of stability. And without the cooperation of our Turkish friends, it will not be possible to manage the refugee crisis. That is why we are in favor of the measures taken by the European Commission, and we truly appreciate the work done in particular by Vice President Timmermans. But stretching out a hand to Turkey doesn't mean that we're giving them a blank check, and it definitely doesn't mean that we're underestimating the fact that it is a slippery slope. And what is happening is worrying. I am very worried about what is happening with fundamental rights and the breaches in Turkey. I'm thinking about attacks against minorities, especially against the Kurds. None of this is acceptable, and even the concentration of power in the hands of one individual harms democracy. As was said, Mr. Timmermans, and rightly so, we hope that this money will end up in the hands of the refugees and will help them. So, yes, we support what you're doing, but this agreement shouldn't be turned into a kind of forced marriage where we know what the outcome will be.
Thank you, Mr. Pittella. Mr. Pittella, Mr. Christoforou has asked to put a question to you. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Mr. Pittella, you said Turkey is a center of stability, but you know that even before the ink of its signature was dry, and even though Greece and Cyprus and other countries supported the measures, before it even left the European Council, it sent its planes to violate the airspace of Greece and Cyprus, and that's just one example of many other cases. And Turkey complains that their airspace is being violated and it brought down the Russian plane. You'd say it's a pole of stability, but I'd like to know how you feel about the fact that Turkey doesn't respect what is being done. Do you really think it is right to open negotiating chapters when it doesn't recognize one of the member states of the EU? What if you were in that position? What if you came from a country that wasn't recognized by Turkey? Would you really accept opening negotiating chapters? Thank you.
Mr. Pittella, go ahead.
Parlavo dell'utilità.
I was saying that Turkey is useful when it comes to stability because, as you all know, we cannot solve the refugee crisis just by working with Turkey. Do we want to correct the mistakes that Turkey is making? Yes, of course, there are serious problems, but then we need to make sure that there are more contacts. Now, opening negotiating chapters doesn't mean that we're saying that they've won the match. On the contrary, we're putting their back up against the wall. We're putting them in a corner. And of course, there's the whole issue of the Cyprus question. We feel very strongly about there being a settlement. But I think that when you want to solve problems, it is useful to have discussions and to actually meet our counterparts. That's the whole point of what I was saying.
Thank you, Mr. Pittella. Now, on behalf of the ECR group, Mr. Kamall, the chairman. Now, unfortunately, just a second. Unfortunately, the public in the gallery is not entitled to clap or show any pleasure or displeasure. We're happy that you support our members, but please remain dispassionate and neutral. Mr. Kamall, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I hope I'm not going to take that personally, that you're telling them not to clap at me, but I welcome all the applause I get, frankly. In this crisis, thank you. I'll get some of my members to clap me. In this crisis, we are lurching from one day to the next, grasping at straws, not really getting to grips with the fundamental issues. Yes, it's good to have a summit with Turkey to discuss cooperation, and we welcome that. But there's a big difference between cooperating with Turkey and asking them to clear up our mess. We feel under a humanitarian and moral obligation to help refugees from Syria who settle in neighbouring countries. And whatever we do will cost money. But we also need to be clear about the signal that we are going to send to those who want to come to the EU, whether they are coming as refugees or coming for economic reasons. So instead, the leader of a large member state sends a signal that the EU is open to everyone, whether or not they are a refugee. And then when other EU countries struggle and erect borders to each other, EU leaders ask Turkey to play host instead, on top of the millions that they already host. Now, this is unlikely to offer a long-term solution to the crisis, and it will do nothing to stem the flows from the Balkan states. Yes, Turkey is a major, important NATO ally of ours, but as Turkey's ally, let us be more honest with them. Let us not pretend that EU membership is on the horizon. There are far too many people in the EU who will never accept Turkey for reasons including pure prejudice against Turks and their faith, concerns over human rights, concerns over freedom of movement, concerns over the number of votes that they would have in Council and Parliament, concerns over EU borders being extended to Iraq, Iran and Syria. So let us be clear to Turks about what that relationship is. But let us also be clear to our voters what EU countries get in return for signing a visa-free agreement and what we get in return for the €3 billion that Turkey is demanding. And let us finally get to grips with some of the basics. A thorough registration process, a proper returns and readmissions agreement with countries in exchange for our aid, and effective external border controls. Let us work together to build long-term solutions, not offer short-term promises that will never be fulfilled.
Thank you, Mr. Kamall. Mr. Kamall, there's a veritable flood of blue cards coming your way. But it'll be first come, first served. Ms. Forenza, therefore, has a question for you. Do you accept?
You talked about Turkey as an ally of the European Union since it's a NATO member. I'd like to know what you think of what the Erdogan government is doing vis-à-vis the Kurdish people. Does the European Parliament factor that in? We just heard a colleague say that we shouldn't hand a blank check to Turkey, but shouldn't be worried about the fact that we're giving money to a government that is massacring its own people.
Yes.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Liberals, Mr. Verhofstadt.
I want to continue where Mr. Kamall ended. I think cooperation with Turkey, yes. Outsourcing our problems, no. That's the fact. And let's be honest, the impression that we have is the opposite. A visa-free regime, €3 billion, speeding up the accession negotiations, for some Turkish cooperation in helping to manage the refugee crisis. And that, I have to tell you, Mr. President, I find it shameful that in the written conclusions, nothing was said about human rights in Turkey, freedom of press in Turkey, state of democracy in Turkey. That is the failure of this summit, in my opinion. Because let's be honest, the situation in Turkey is becoming worse and worse. We have seen now a country in which, I think there is no other country worldwide where there are more journalists in jail, in prison, than for the moment in Turkey. So I have nothing against the search of a better cooperation with Turkey to manage the refugee crisis, but at least have the honesty, have the courage to talk about the problems in Turkey and not to do, okay, we don't talk about them anymore, not in the conclusions. It's only at the end, in the press conference, that Mr. Tusk has said 3-4 words about it, and not in the written conclusions. And that brings me to the key point. not outsourcing our problems, but solving our problems. That means that we have to fix our external borders, our European border and coast guard. And what I see is that we are not capable to do so. That especially Greece is saying, yeah, we cannot participate because it is the only country for the moment blocking a decision in the Council that has to be taken in a few days, in a few weeks, in December, in a few days. Blocking it because they say, yeah, but it's a question of sovereignty. It's not allowed that foreigners are coming to help us to protect our borders. Well, maybe, Mr. President, we could invite Mr. Tsipras a second time to this Parliament, not to talk about economy and not to talk about this problem, but to talk about his lack of willing European solutions for the problems that he is facing for the moment. And so, I was not shocked when this morning I read some countries want to push Greece out of Schengen. Well, the external border of Greece is not a Greek border, it's a European border. It's also a German border, a Belgian border, a French border, and that's the key. And that is what you have to achieve now, with or without Mr. Tsipras.
Oh Gott. Herr Verhofstadt.
Mr. Verhofstadt, millions of people feel pressed to ask a question, so Mr. Jurek. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Tsipras is a friend of yours, not a friend of mine, I hasten to add, but anyway, I have the following question. Do you realize that Greece is falling prey to mafias, human traffickers? This has been happening for months and months. There is trafficking in human beings flowing in from Turkey, and we are closing our eyes to this as if it weren't happening. Previously, we didn't tackle immigration in. You know there's a problem. We've got to look at that.
And it's exactly to tackle human trafficking, to tackle these criminal gangs, to help the Greek government that we want this European border and coast guard. The fundamental problem that we have created is to start with Schengen and not to have a common border system. That cannot work. Or you have a common area with a free mobility of people and traveling, well, then you need to have also your common border and coast guard. And that's the best way to tackle these criminal gangs, is to start with this European instrument, a European tool.
Vielen Dank. Das Wort hat hier.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Mr. Giorgio on behalf of the European United Left.
First of all, I would like to say something to Mr. Verhofstadt. Belgium doesn't have the same problems as Greece, but despite this, it seems to be a turning point for criminals. Greece has a lot of problems that stem from EU decisions, and I think it needs support rather than condemnation in the European Parliament. The agreement with Turkey was mainly about how to manage the refugee flow, but the EU has the obligation to show that the trials and tribulations of the people started when the United States and EU member states decided how to teach democracy to others. When we were saying that an Arab winter was around the corner, there were even people in this chamber who harbored the illusion of an Arab Spring. The European Commission has to closely monitor the management of the billions that are being given to Turkey. There are refugees in primitive camps, but there are also thousands of people who live in terrible conditions. Today it is being said that Turkey, only a few days after the agreement, arrested 1,200 refugees and is planning to send them where? Back to Syria. I think the European Commission has to react immediately. You're not pointing the finger at the problems of democracy in Turkey, and yet you say you're going to open chapters. Turkey, we are in favor of this if Turkey also shows that it will help find a settlement to the Cyprus question, which will make it truly independent. Now, the only settlement that can really prevail is if the future is in the hands of the Cypriots, based on EU rules and the security given to us by the fact that we are a member of the EU. The Cypriots of a federal state do not need guarantor powers, because there is no settlement, despite the fact that the decades have gone by, and we mustn't lose this opportunity because Turkey wants to continue being a guarantor or a monitor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Hadji Georgia. And on behalf of the Greens, Mrs. Harms. Presidents, colleagues, my group has always spoken out in favour of the European Union working with Turkey in a systematic way. There is no doubt in our minds that Europe needs Turkey and Turkey needs Europe. And it was really rather depressing to hear the debate about the future of Turkey in Europe. Now that umpteen thousand of refugees are coming from Turkey to Europe, the leaders of the European Union have woken up and realized that actually we do need Turkey. There were far better times to discuss visa liberalization or negotiations with Turkey. It's a good thing that things have become unblocked, but really European leaders and the European institutions, Council included, haven't been aware of their problems. And you know, they realize now how difficult it is going to be to achieve some of these with Turkey. Better accommodation for refugees, a future for children, a future and employment for people there. That's the kind of thing you want. But how are you going to provide guarantees that the Turkish authorities will provide this? I have to say I'm rather distrustful about this. In fact, this agreement will be interpreted in Turkey in a different way, that people want to push people back. They want to stop people coming into Europe, and what may end up happening is that people will be arrested. If that's what happens, this is a new step that the European Union takes away from its own values and away from international law. And we've heard news to this effect from Turkey recently. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've got to be far more on the offensive on human rights with Turkey. We can't allow what happens in Turkey to continue. There's been the murder of a lawyer there immediately before the summit. There were arrests of journalists, some of them known to us personally, such as Shandun. There were provocations prior to the summit. I'd like the European Union to be far more active in developing better relations with Turkey, but I really don't think that Turkey is a reliable partner to address refugee issues or on Syria. Because if you look at the domestic developments in Turkey, there are things happening that we can't ignore. Democrats will only feel shocked at what's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, I have here a list, a sort of memorial of the journalists under arrest. I'd be happy to hand it to Council and Commission, and I hope that this list is not ignored in the future. Please conclude, Mrs. Harms. Finish. Please, Mrs. Harms, don't run away. Lots of people want to ask you a question. Mr. Etheridge.
Listening to the speech, I note that you're interested in closer cooperation, but you still had great reservations about the Turkish government. Thank goodness, I'm glad you do. I was wondering, does this closer cooperation eventually, in your mind, lead to Turkish membership of the EU? And if so, do you feel the same as me, that whenever I've been to Turkey, almost everyone I speak to says they want to move to the EU? It would lead to a migration situation of an even greater problem than we've ever faced before. Do you agree that this would be a dangerous folly at the moment to even consider Turkish membership of the EU any time in our lifetime, really?
Mrs. Harms. Yes, I am in favour of the European Union to act on the basis of the treaties and to deliver what it's promised to Turkey, and that means serious and systematic negotiations with that country. I think it's good that things are being taken in hand. Now, as for the question of membership of the European Union, how and when, that is in fact pretty controversial in Turkey itself. But all parties wanted negotiations, and the European Union has to do what it promised to do in 2004. Thank you very much. Now on behalf of the EFDD, Mr. Farage.
Failures in my long years here, the introduction of a currency that's impoverished the Mediterranean. I've seen the idealised Schengen area lead to the free movement of Kalashnikovs, and every single week and month we see the attempt to create a single state of Europe, which of course the European peoples don't want. But the EU's common asylum policy is the lowest ebb for policy yet. Chancellor Merkel took the cork out of a champagne bottle and said anyone could come, and now you're trying to put the cork back in and realising it's not possible. So you've turned to somebody else to sort out your own problem. So let's talk Turkey. They have taken your weakness and they've now decided they're going to blackmail you. Not only do they want €3 billion from you this year, they're going to want €3 billion from you every single year. And in return, they've given absolutely no guarantees whatsoever that they will stop people from coming or indeed take people back. And they've managed to persuade you, whatever the Commissioner says, into offering them, by October next year, visa-free access for 75 million people whose average GDP income is half that of the poorest EU member state. I guess what you're doing is you're saying the way we'll stop illegal immigration is to make it all legal immigration. And if that doesn't take the biscuit, now you're going to fast-track Turkey to be an EU member. So let's just think about that. A country, 97% of whose landmass is in Asia, apparently you want to join Europe. It is a country that appears to be keener on bombing the Kurds than it is on taking on ISIS. It is a country that has turned a complete blind eye to ISIS fighters travelling through its territory. It is a country, according to the Pew Institute, whose poll last week showed that 8% of those 75 million actively encourage and support the aims of ISIS. It is a country directly and closely linked with buying ISIS oil, and we will finish up bordering Syria, Iraq and Iran. It is mad. It is the most dangerous decision the European Union has yet taken. I'm sure the British Prime Minister will be delighted. He's campaigned for this since 2005. To me, without any of the other debate, if there was one single reason why Britain should, in this referendum, vote to leave the European Union, it is the folly of political integration with Turkey. It is not only stupid, it is damned dangerous.
Mr. Farage, Mr. Vajgl has a question to ask you.
Mr. Farage, you were very determined when describing all the bad things you see in our relationship with Turkey. Could you name another country which in this point of time could make a more efficient contribution towards what we are trying to combat today? We're trying to get a grip of the refugee crisis. And the second question, were you just as determined when speaking at home, where your country participated in destroying the countries which the refugees are now fleeing?
Believe you me, I was no supporter of Tony Blair's endless series of wars, and if I was in a different parliament and not this one, I would vote against the bombing campaign that Mr Cameron wishes to join the Americans and French in, because it has been poorly, badly thought through with no long-term strategy whatsoever. Look, if you want to deal with a problem that you've caused yourself in life, rather than relying on somebody else to do it for you, perhaps it's better to recognise and realise you've made a mistake. And the only solution open to the European Union is to follow the example of Australia, who from 2008 onwards had a lot of boats heading towards their country, a lot of boats sinking, a lot of people drowning, many of the similar symptoms and problems, and the Australians said, if you wish to become a refugee or a migrant to Australia, you will not succeed in doing so if you come via this route. And the boats stopped coming. And the EU needs to have the moral courage to stand up and say that, but frankly, they haven't got the guts.
Köszönöm, Farage úr. Következő hozzászólónk, de Graaff képviselő úr.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. de Graaff.
President, the European elite has genuflected before the Sultan of Ankara. Turkey's getting 3 billion euros, so 75 million Turks will be able to march into Europe at the end of 2016, and the collapse is just a question of time. The institutions want to have a new Ottoman Empire in Europe, and we're seeing mosques which will become the barracks. There'll be soldiers coming over the border and in our midst. We're seeing that Sharia will be implemented. There is no moderate Islam. How clear do you want to see these things? We have a Western culture and democracy that needs to be defended. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be cajoled, and we should never be dependent on a dictator. Close the internal borders. That is the answer to the migratory flows and the Turkish invasion. And this is why, President, we have to make sure of one thing, and that is that Turkey never becomes a member of the European Union in 100,000 years.
Következő hozzászólónk a független képviselők között.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Synadinos.
Öné a szó.
Madam President, I would like to counter what Mr. Weber and Mr. Verhofstadt said about Greece. After doing that, the European Union, with these two gentlemen, has shown its true face. We want to hand over money and start laying the groundwork for opening negotiating chapters with a country that cooperates with ISIS. It brings down military planes that is fighting jihadists because it violated its airspace for 17 seconds, and yet when it violates Greek airspace, no one seems to mind, and it smuggles drugs, and traffickers are benefiting from all of this. People are dying at sea. There's a Now, with the excuse of so-called search and rescue, you want to undermine the sovereignty of Greece. I'm sorry, this is not a serious approach unless you want to EU member states to disintegrate and collapse, and unless you want to start a new disastrous war.
Képviselőtársaim, ezzel a vezérszónoki körnek a végére értünk most az.
That concludes this round of speakers. We move on to individual speakers. First of all, Mr. Pre.
Merci infiniment, Madame la Présidente. Moi, je suis content de découvrir dans le.
I was happy to read in Sunday's document that Europe and Turkey have rediscovered a joint future, but I do regret the fact that they've only discovered this following on such a terrible crisis, such as we've seen in recent months. And I also find it regrettable that this should have taken place after a second set of attacks in Turkey, but better late than never. And also, I welcome what was agreed. As for the money being given to Turkey to manage the migrant situation, we should stump that up quickly. We shouldn't generate any difficulties in funding that funding. And I think Turkey has also been clear in its commitments. Now, as far as the accession process is concerned, I was pleased to learn that Chapter 17 will open. That's an important step forward. I think the postponing the reopening of chapters was mistaken, and I think that other chapters should also be tackled if there is genuine progress on the Northern Cyprus dossier. That's an important condition. Finally, I really don't know why our Greeks are so unhappy that they're being criticized because Greece bears huge responsibility, and in future weeks Greece has to show solidarity and back our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Fleckenstein. In 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen. Sunday produced a good result, and once again, Vice President Timmermans, I would like to thank you, because you put in a lot of effort, a lot of work, and indeed a lot of empathy in that work. Otherwise, this sort of result I don't think would ever have seen the light of day. I have to admit that it is perhaps not the best juncture for this sort of agreement. Following on from what we've seen in the news and on television, nevertheless, it is correct, and it's correct to open Chapter 17, but I would appeal to you, not just in your dealings with Turkey, but also that we also look at Chapters 23 and 24 and open them as soon as possible. When we talk about freedom and justice, we have to deal with the most knotty issues as soon as possible. My final point, I certainly hope that you won't be left in the lurch again by the member states, because we know that 500 million is not the same as 3 billion. And I think this provides a good opportunity, especially for those who have not wanted to receive any refugees, that they nevertheless want to show solidarity.
Speaker is Mr. Papadimoulis. In 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. Verhofstadt, Mr. Weber, please stop insulting Greece, attacking it and distorting the truth. You're doing this for reasons of political expediency. Greece is shouldering a huge burden in a humanitarian way because it's on the European border and because many European countries don't want to shoulder their share of the burden. My country is saying yes to European cooperation to protect the external borders of the European Union and the Schengen Agreement, but without violating the principle of national sovereignty, as each and every EU member state says. Mr. Verhofstadt was a former Prime Minister of Belgium. Belgium does not share a border with such countries, but despite that, it is a hotbed of terrorism. If you want results, then put an end to the criminal gangs that smuggle human beings from Turkey to Greece. Make sure you have refugees going from Turkey to European countries fairly. Create a European land border. The EU-Turkey agreement, framework agreement, is a good step forward, but it is not a panacea, and we need to have monitoring mechanisms. Turkey will only get the €3 billion interruption. We have to make sure that democracy, human rights, the rule of law are respected.
Én megértem, hogy ez egy nagyon fontos vita.
Mr. Vilimsky. There are time limits, members. I know it can be difficult, but still, stick to your speaking time. And I know that these are issues which make us a bit emotional.
Christos and Miss Christos. There is? Or not? Unfortunately not. But there is another blue card from Ms. Mussolini. Do you accept it? Yes. Ms. Mussolini, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. I wanted to say to our colleague who talked about monitoring of Turkey, that's something that I haven't heard, and that is reciprocity. I have actually witnessed what Turkey has been doing in Cyprus with the way it destroys Orthodox churches. So I think it's important to talk about the problems that exist in relations between the EU and Turkey. Microphone, please. I agree. It wasn't really a question, it was a comment, so let me say that I agree with your comment. But what I would like to point out once again is that if Europe wants to protect its European borders and the Schengen Agreement, then it needs to provide additional technical and organizational assistance as well as funds to Greece, among others, because Greece is shouldering a huge part of the border, showing solidarity and humanitarianism, and we're doing it because geography and history placed us there. We're not lucky enough to be where the Netherlands and Luxembourg are.
Speaker is Mr. Brok. Not here.
No.
No. The next, Bostinaru. Mr. Bostinaru.
Köszönöm szépen, Madam President. Domnule prim vicepreședinte al Comisiei Europene, doresc din start să...
Thank you. Commissioner, allow me to extend my thanks to you for negotiating so well in such difficult circumstances. Now, on repeated occasions, our group has asked Council and Commission to come forward with assistance to Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan so that they can face up to the huge influx of refugees. These countries face far more in the way than difficulties than we do in Europe. It's a good agreement, even if it does come in extremely late in the day. It's very important in terms of our anti-terrorist strategy and in the management of the refugee crisis. It will help us bring stability to Syria. We can't work without a partner like Turkey. We really can't address these problems without them. I have no hesitation in saying to you that the accession negotiations for Turkey must move forward over and above Chapter 17, 23 and 24 are very important, the latter two on fundamental freedoms.
Thank you. I do apologize. I did actually skip Mr. Wilimski. No microphone for the speaker. Well, there seems to be a bit of a farce in this burlesque theatre. There's one thing who has cut a rather poor show, Mr. Weber from the EPP, who's no longer here, who's really pointed the finger fully at Greece. You can't really maintain that they are the main person responsible. Actually, it's Chancellor Merkel from Germany. Unfortunately, as an Austrian, I have to say, complicit with President Faymann of Austria, who really got this whole thing moving. And now creating this disaster and blaming somebody else is unfair, first of all, and secondly, it's a very shabby way of dealing with the Turks. Looking at the amounts of monies going there, you've got 5 billion for pre-accession aid, now an additional 3 billion being thrown at them, I'm sure is something that is not up for discussion. And I'm sure Turkey will never be able to be a member of this European community. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Brok.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thanks very much.
But never try order with me.
Every other single MEP, if they miss their time, they miss their...
Mr. Brok, you have the floor. Mr. Brok. Mr. Brok, you have the floor.
Sir, I was in the room, but not on my seat.
Well, you should have been in your seat.
No. No, I have to be in the chair. No, because I was in the chamber, but not on my seat. And I have not to be on my seat. I have not to be in my seat. And
Mr. Brok, 1 minute, please. Mr. Brok. 1 minute. Képviselő úr, ön ne kiabáljon.
Sir, please don't stand and please don't shout. I did explain what the situation was. I actually missed out some people on the list. And please don't shout here. I did express my apologies. Maybe you didn't hear what I was saying. But Mr. Brok is after Mr. Wilimski. It's absolutely correct that he should be given the floor. It wasn't a point of order that you raised, and I don't need to explain that, but I did want to step in because you shouldn't just shout out like that. Mr. Brok, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, listening to the argumentation of the last speaker, he would like more refugees to come into Austria, but the fact of the matter is you can stop the flow of refugees. Only with Turkey's come to, so he's actually arguing in favour of more refugees for Austria. Anyway, on to the heart of the question. I'd like to thank Council and Commission for what they've done. This is a way of putting some order into the situation. Recent figures. Turkey has had 2 million of refugees, 4 million in Lebanon and 1 million in Jordan. We've got an obligation to assist these countries. And that will, of course, mean that we've got get fewer refugees come into these countries. We want these people to be treated decently, and the providing system do that. That's the right way forward, to my way of thinking. We also need to build up better methods in our external borders to register refugees. A system of quotas for member states is also useful, one that is transparent. That seems to me the way of reducing the pressure. But can I say one final word? This would only work if we can put an end to the war there. And that can only happen with Turkey and be opening chapters with Turkey on the rule of law, on human rights is something that I'm really looking forward to, because Turkey will have to show exactly what it's doing. Because Turkey can't be a member if 71 decisions require our vote in favour. But talking about human rights in Turkey is a very interesting topic. But anyway, the point is to reduce the flow of refugees. That's got to be a good thing.
There is a blue card from Mr. Sani and others. Do you accept it? Yes. The first is Mr. Sani. Mr. Sani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Brok, I'd like to ask you personally, you're probably one of the most experienced foreign affairs politicians in the European Parliament. I'm sure you've seen many cases where one of the parties has made a mistake and an agreement was not reached as a result. If the EU weren't to pay out the 3 billion as promised, and the Turks say then that they can carry on letting migrants through, are there any guarantees that that can be prevented from happening?
Now, well, if we don't pay up the money, we won't be delivering a deal. But anyway, it's not just paying the money to the Turkish state, it's for projects, and these have to be rolled out. They're going to be rolled out properly in a phased approach. So really, I don't think there is this danger. I think Turkey has every interest in this deal. They should deliver on their part of the bargain, then chapters will be opened up. But as I said before, we've got to put an end to the war there. But that's got to entail the stopping the flow of money to the IS and the export of oil. Turkey's got to be in the same boat as us, and I think that is a good agreement.
Next speaker is Mr. Borgencio in 1 minute.
Thank you. Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think in the future we should talk about the Paris attacks and the decision to open Europe's door to Turkey when they're sending out the opposite signals. We had suspended negotiations for a very clear reason, because we thought, and rightly so, that Turkey was an Islamic country. And Turkey is no longer Islamic. This is the Turkey of Erdogan. In 2008, he went to Germany and made incendiary comments. Now we no longer talk about these, and now we're liberalizing visas. And now we're actually, European citizens are wondering what we're doing with 75 million citizens, most of which are Muslim. Have we really forgotten about freedom of the press, human rights? Are we sacrificing all of these? Are we ignoring the voices of journalists languishing in jail? We want to remind Europe of these values, but we seem to be sacrificing them. I think Europe should be ashamed of itself.
Mr. Borghezio, there is a blue card from Mr. Frunzulică. Do you accept? Do you accept this blue card? Si. Mr. Frunzulică.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Borghezio, the Turkish geostrategic space is part of the Euro-Atlantic one. It's part of the southeastern Europe somehow. And everything what's going on in Turkey is influencing very much the European security and defense. Don't you think that we need Turkey for Europe's security? Because Italy, as Turkey, there are Mediterranean states. And security of Europe is influenced very much by Turkey. We have to cooperate with Turkey.
Mr. Borghezio?
I think that the recent events and the way that Turkey has provoked Russia with enormous risks for peace is perhaps the best answer to your question.
Következő hozzászólónk Kovácsev képviselő úr, 1,5 percben.
Now Mr. Kovacev.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, on a domestic policy, in domestic policy terms, we need to do our homework, protect the borders of the EU, fight terrorism, a common intelligence agency. And secondly, in terms of foreign policy, the question is whether we can cope with the present challenge with or without Turkey. The obvious answer is that we need cooperation, not only with Turkey, but also Lebanon, Jordan, and the African countries. But we should be very clear and frank. Negotiations with Turkey are different from previous negotiations. These are open-ended negotiations, and no decision has been taken concerning about Turkey's full membership. At this point in time, such membership is impossible. For us, of course, it's important to conduct negotiations with Turkey, to have a predictable partner who complies with European legislation, honors its obligation, and accepts our legislation. Negotiation can help us support Turkish democracy and civil society. We need to follow very closely whether the hand we have outstretched will help improve human rights and freedom of media. We need to do everything we can to keep the millions currently in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan where they are and not set out towards Europe. Every euro invested in this saves many more euros in maintaining a single person on the territory of the EU. We must, of course, follow very closely how all the funds will be spent together with the UNHCR. Thank you.
Card from Mr. Ujazdowski. Do you accept it? Mr. Ujazdowski, you have the floor.
Chciałbym zapytać o jedną kwestię, mianowicie o ile rozumiem.
Thank you very much. I have a question. If I understood correctly, this cooperation between European forces and Frontex is a fait accompli. So I don't understand why a member of the EPP wants us to create a joint intelligence agency. There's no legal basis for this on the basis of the current treaties. So what are your views on this common intelligence service?
Of course we need to cooperate more in Europe. Common intelligence service, common command. Perhaps you know, perhaps you don't know, this cooperation is not as it should be. There are only a few countries which exchange information. And for me, coping with global challenges requires that we join our efforts. And this includes a common European army. This is an idea which was first launched in the 1950s. Of course, not an army which doubles the efforts of NATO.
Thank you very much. Kati Piri now.
It is important that there is a deal with Turkey that will make the influx of refugees to Europe manageable. For too long, we did not pay enough attention to the efforts made by the Turkish population by hosting 2.2 million refugees. And with this summit, it was recognized that only in partnership can this refugee crisis be handled. However, an essential part of the EU-Turkey agreement is missing, which is, due to internal divisions among EU member states, the fact about resettlement. No agreement has been reached on this yet, and I was at least pleased to hear the First Vice President Timmermans also mention this, that there are plans, and let's hope member states will commit to this in the next summit. I welcome the reinvigoration of the accession talks. It's a pity that this crisis was needed to convince member states that a more intensive dialogue between the EU and Turkey is very much in the interest of both. We do, however, have serious concerns about internal developments in Turkey, already mentioned here by colleagues. In order to make this new momentum last, it must be clear to both sides that the accession process is merit-based, with respect for the rule of law and fundamental freedom at its core. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings this round to a close. Maybe you could just take your personal conversations outside the chamber. Now we have the Catch the Eye. There's a very long list of people. From each group, then I will give one person the floor. First of all, Mr. Christoforou
has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I don't think there is anyone here who wouldn't recognize that the refugee crisis is a serious problem and that we need to work hand in hand with Turkey. But we need cooperation with Turkey, but that doesn't mean that we should be giving Turkey certain advantages. Turkey also has to shoulder its part of the responsibility. No one is calling into question the suspicious role that Turkey was involved in when it comes to even the creation of the refugee crisis. What has Turkey really done so far to solve this? What is its role in the region? Is it really fighting ISIS and terrorism when it's attacking Kurds and bringing down a plane that was fighting against the terrorists, and at the same time it's violating the airspace of EU member states without the EU batting an eyelid? Do we really think that it's Turkey that is going to fulfill its commitments vis-à-vis the EU? Take the Ankara Protocol. This is something that ties the EU to Turkey. But look at what's happening there. We want to believe that Turkey will solve problems, but up to now it's only been creating problems, and all it does is demanding things without giving anything in return.
The next speaker is Mr. Serrao in 1 minute. Mr. Serrao, you have the floor.
This debate, but for the next debate on circular economy. Thank you.
I give the floor to Mr. Mavrias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Timmermans, the problem is the influx of refugees, and yet here we are debating opening negotiating chapters, and I'm speaking very slowly, sir, so that you can pay attention to me. You're suggesting that we open these negotiating chapters with Erdogan, but these chapters have been suspended because, among among other reasons, Turkey is violating the principles and values of the European Union, and it also illegally occupies 1/3 of the Republic of Cyprus, which is an EU member state. Therefore, would you ever say yes to opening negotiating chapters if Turkey was illegally occupying 1/3 of your European country? And let's not just talk about values and principles. We're giving something to Erdogan on a silver platter, despite the fact that he hasn't been honoring his commitments so far.
Speaker is Mr. Marias.
Madam President, the EU leaders have not risen to the occasion because they seem to be succumbing to the blackmail of Turkey. Turkey isn't fighting against ISIS and is involved in oil smuggling. They're the ones who are organizing the smuggling of so many refugees from Syria to the Greek islands. We're talking about millions of euro. Turkey is still violating Greek airspace. Ladies and gentlemen, in the EU, you're asking the wolf to look over sheep. We have a huge influx of refugees in Greece because Germany invited them to Europe, but Greece is a sovereign country and is not going to negotiate the issue of co-managing its borders. You must understand that Greek borders are Greek, and it's Greek people who will continue protecting them. It won't be German troops as you're dreaming of, because that is relegated to history. It's part of the past of 70 years ago.
To Mr. Jakovčić.
Gospođo predsjedavajuća, poštovani gospodine potpredsjedniče.
Thank you very much, President in Office, Vice President of the Commission. Let's be frank here. Let's tell the truth. This is a needs-must agreement. It's needed because of the situation in the European Union and because of everything that has happened because of the migration crisis that has been brought upon the European Union. Despite all this, I think nevertheless we should be cooperating, negotiating, and indeed communicating. I think we can't turn a blind eye to what's going on, and I think the Commission is well aware of what's going on in Turkey when it comes to freedom of expression and human rights. And it's for this reason that I say that this is an agreement that is sorely needed. We have to help the refugees. They come from parts of the world where war is reigning, and I think we have to open these negotiating chapters. We have to open 23 and 24.
Sakorafa képviselő asszony.
Mr. Sakorafa.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've heard a lot of people welcome the package that has been given to Turkey and to be in favor of it, but I think it's hypocritical of us to be in favor of measures that create camps that will house millions of people without us accepting our historical responsibilities. The EU and its 500,000 citizens do not want to accept 3 million refugees and is passing the buck. The solidarity you're proclaiming is but a farce, because the infamous relocation of 160,000 refugees has only been implemented in the case of 159 people. We're creating a generation of prisoners because you know that this situation is not going to be temporary. Have you ever really thought about the consequences of the situation in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon? I can tell you what's going to happen. It will be the breeding ground of extreme and fanatical ideologies that will only make the current problems continue in the future. This is even more relevant since many of you are saying that jihadists are lurking among the refugees. It is this short-sighted EU policy that will bring problems and instability to the region. Thank you.
Is Ms. Keller.
Colleagues, let's be clear. This is a deal where Turkey is supposed to stop refugees in return for the European Union turning a blind eye on human rights. And this is bad for the refugees who will be detained and pushed back into Syria. But this is also bad for people in Turkey, those people who are really looking and hoping for EU accession, for EU values, for the Kurds, and for journalists like Can Dündar, who just got arrested a couple of days ago in Turkey. So I would like to ask the Commissioner, Vice President for Fundamental Rights, what fundamental rights mean to you in this agreement. Thank you.
És az utolsó hozzászólók sorában...
Thank you very much. Last speaker, Mr. Epitideios.
The EU is panic-stricken, and at the same time it's very weak. It cannot deal with the huge influx of illegal migrants, and because all of this, it has turned Turkey into a god, and it is given it a blank check. And what it wants in return is some kind of help, and we're unsure exactly what this is. Turkey is solely responsible for all these illegal migrants who flock to Greece and Europe. Turkey is blackmailing us in order to achieve its technical interests. So what kind of guarantees are we asking from Turkey to make sure that we're not duped again? What kind of guarantees are we demanding to make sure that they honor their commitments? Are we going to be bold enough to make sure that Turkey stops smugglers? Do we have the guts to make sure that Turkey doesn't take advantage of these desperate people? Because if we do not have the guts, then we won't be able to achieve anything.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the Catch the Eye section of this debate. We had a very intensive, fairly emotional debate as well, and now Mr. Timmermans has the floor.
When I hear Mr. de Graaff and some of his colleagues refer to the beauty of European civilization, the way they do it, I'm reminded of what Gandhi said when he was asked what he thought about European civilization. His answer was, it would be a good idea. Let's not lose track of the reasons for people coming to Europe. They're not coming to Europe because Mrs. Merkel invited them. They're coming to Europe because they want their children not to be victims of barrel bombs thrown from Assad's plane. They want to come to Europe because they don't want to be slaughtered by Daesh or al-Nusra in other parts of Syria. They want to come to Europe because after years of an atrocious war, they have nowhere else to go if they want their children to have education, if they want to have some health care, if they want a future that every single one of you wants for yourself and your children as well. We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about fortune seekers invited by Mrs. Merkel. Mrs. Merkel took a responsibility to offer international protection when it was necessary. We would have less trouble in Europe if every single leader of Europe would have done the same when it was necessary at the time. Now let me insist on some of the push factors, because it is important for the agreement we've reached with Turkey. As I said before, why are some people leaving from Turkey or through Turkey to Europe? Talk to them. Try it. These are nice people, educated people. These are people who can tell you a story. They will tell you. I have left because after 2 years, I am finished. All my savings are gone, and I am not allowed to work in Turkey. So what did we do? We agreed with the Turks that they would allow Syrians to start working in Turkey very soon. That's part of what we have discussed. They say, I'm leaving because there is no education for my children. It's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use the 3 billion to make sure that there's more facilities for education for children where they are now in Turkey. They said, we're leaving because our living conditions are horrible and we don't have access to medical care. These 3 billion will be used to improve living conditions and to improve medical care. It is not just the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, because keeping people there and offering them help there is much cheaper for the European taxpayer and is much cheaper in moral terms, because it takes the smugglers out of the equation, it takes the danger out of the equation for people having to cross the Mediterranean on, in very difficult conditions. So when we have these agreements on these projects, it is to take away some of the push factors. This is, I think, a smart approach. Visa liberalisation. Why are we in this trajectory with the Turks? Because if we align our visa policies, it would be easier for the Turks to act at their external borders when people come from Pakistan, Bangladesh or other countries who do not have the right to international protection and should then be stopped at the borders. Visa liberalisation also means that we can create the right conditions for Turkey to have the right kind of passports, biometric passports, will make it much easier for us to control our borders. These are positive measures for the European Union. Don't portray everything as though we are on our knees for Turkey and giving them things away. Then about the chapters. I really don't understand that some here, like Ms. Keller just now, said, we don't want to talk, we've given up on human rights, we accept everything. Benchmarking chapter 23 and 24 is the best possible way of engaging Turkey in a debate on human rights. Opening chapters 23 and 24 is the best possible way of forcing the Turks to account for what they're doing and to try and help them reform the system so that they move away from the mistakes they make today. So, do you really think that we will improve the situation in Turkey by turning our backs to the Turks and say, let it go? I don't think so. I think this engaging with them will yield results. And yes, of course, we're engaging with them because we need to stem the flow of those coming to Europe who do not have the right to international protection. Of course we're doing that. Of course. But it is in our interest to do so, it's in the interest of the refugees to do so, and it's in the interest of Turkey to do so. There is no shame in coming to an agreement based on mutual interest. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Köszönjük, elnök helyettes úr, képviselőtársaim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. That concludes this debate. We now move on to the next debate on the agenda. This is the Commission statement on the circular economy package. First of all, I give the floor to Mr. Vice President Timmermans.
Once again, custom sippe. This morning, we have adopted an important package on the circular economy in the Commission. It is the result of very intensive teamwork, and it really is a pleasure to present this package to you today, together with Vice President Katainen and Commissioner Vella. I hope, yes, Commissioner Vella is here. This is a really innovative way of working in the Commission. We have worked together with more than half of the commissioners during a year to bring everything together, because here, if we want to make this transformation, we need all areas of our activities. And so this novel way of working is something that is also the way forward for the way the Commission should be working in the future. In the week that COP21 in Paris has started, this is, I think, a very timely proposal. Action on the circular economy ties in closely with our energy and climate policies. More and more evidence shows the wider benefits of the circular economy, including in lowering carbon dioxide emissions. There are many, many good reasons for moving away from our linear economic model that is extremely resource intensive. In a world where population rises every day, with huge demand placed on land, water, food, feed, raw materials and energy, we cannot rely further on a take, make, use and throw away approach. The circular economy, as an agenda for change, is not only an environmental necessity. It is the only model that makes sense in the long term for our European economy. It makes economic sense to use natural resources in a smarter way. Europe cannot compete on wage costs, although sometimes we try and we lose. And Europe is not graced with the same natural resources as other parts of the world. They are finite in Europe, and when they are available, they are very expensive. The future is in providing products that are used and reused and don't deplete the Earth's natural resources. It will also allow us to continue as a market leader for green technologies. So the question is not whether we want to set Europe on a circular path of growth. It is rather how we, at our level, help our businesses, citizens and member states to get there where they want to be, where they need to be, and to get there more quickly and in a better shape. With the package we are proposing today, we want to give a concrete push to the circular economy and accelerate the transition. What we are presenting is an ambitious and comprehensive EU framework that Europe needs to take action and make real progress towards the circular economy. It is an all-encompassing approach of smart regulation, market-based instruments, innovation and incentives. It is a clear signal to economic operators that we are simplifying the EU single market in this area to create new business opportunities and to boost the market for secondary raw materials. We want to be more ambitious than in the past by going beyond waste with measures covering the full life cycle of products, from the design of a product and production processes, over better informed consumption choices to modern waste management. We want to back this up with our financial instruments and funds. Our action plan and revised waste proposals adopted today are mutually supportive measures that will contribute to making real progress on the ground. While Jyrki shortly will go into more detail on the wide range of actions we propose, let me say a word about our waste management proposals. Continuously advancing on waste management remains a priority, with targets and through incentives and support for recycling and reuse. We want to ensure that resources stay within the circle